Good morning, everyone. We have arrived at a Friday again. I apologize for my voice today. Good life advice, never kiss the sick baby, which I did. I never learn. If I take some breaks, um, know that I'm probably just catching my breath. We've had an eventful week. As always, I'm going to start with the candy first. We're going to eat the dessert first here. So Lots of you across the state are doing all sorts of things, and there is actually a page called Hands Off Medicaid Wisconsin that has lots of convenient little short videos about different aspects of Medicaid that are being made by one of your Wisconsin fellows. So if you are saying, I just don't know what to share on my social media anymore, or you're looking for tips on how to maybe do your own video, here are a number of examples of things people have recorded across the state, and they are available for you to share as well. We also had a person contact us. They had an interview on a statewide podcast. So some of you have taken advice and reached out to contacts and gotten interviews and coverage. And I think now is an especially good time to keep reaching out with your stories in places you haven't before, because now that things are real, they've been real for us since January, to be clear, but now they're really real. There's a lot of attention and a lot more interest and a lot more opportunity for people to get a hold of reporters or podcasts or other people who are creating content and now have a real interest in what do Medicaid cuts mean for real people. Some of you may have watched the House Energy and Commerce hearing that happened this week. It was more than 24 hours long. I don't know if we have any Gold Star people who watched the entire thing. I certainly watched part of it, but I can't claim 24 hours worth. But this is a picture from that hearing. And what I want you to notice about it is that when I watched the beginning part of the hearing, and every, at least Democratic member, started off the hearing talking about people who they had heard from in their districts, constituents, and their Medicaid stories. And they all had pictures of these people who had contacted them with their stories. So for all of you who have been writing letters or writing emails or sending pictures to your members, we did not have a member of the Wisconsin delegation on this committee, but every single person on the Democratic side was reading and showing stories from people just like you who had contacted them. And it kept coming up in the hearing, like they had multiple stories. So this is a nice picture of some of the people that were featured as that debate continued. And it went on, not quite for the record, but it went on, I think, 26 hours. So there were lots of amendments, lots of discussion, a lot of it on Medicaid that got out there into the public. And a number of groups, both on Wednesday and Thursday this week, took the opportunity to make a statement. The Energy and Commerce Committee did pass out of committee the bill. So now we're going to be talking a lot today about what is in that and what we know at this moment, which may be shifting and changing over the next few days. But these are organizations that all said, okay, it's time to, plant a flag and now name that there are cuts that are in the public on Medicaid and SNAP, and what do we think about those things? And again, lots of reaction. The whole point of these organizations making these statements was to have many people saying a similar thing, maybe from different perspectives. And these all went out to the major political media outlets as well as wider media network. And we'll see if we have some stories that come out of that as well. I know that there have been several people from these organizations who have already done interviews. So again, this is a way to build momentum and keep the issue in the public sphere. Our friends, the executive director of Disability Rights Wisconsin, had a nice editorial article published in the Milwaukee State Journal this week about a slightly different but related issue. We've talked a little bit about some of the proposed cuts and reorganization and impacts in the federal agencies to disability organizations. And, again, another nice, clear statement about what does that actually mean to real people in the state. So, some of these things are ongoing issues, and you kind of keep looking for opportunities, and they kind of bubble up and get their moment and keep getting their moments in the sun. And that's the intent here. All right. So we got some action this week. It feels like we've been waiting since January for something to become clear. And this is the week in which the Medicaid cuts that we've been talking about since January got unveiled for the first time, and we have some sense of what they are in the moment. So, little bit of overview. We are now at the point where all of the standing committees, education and workforce, all of these committees that have been having markup hearings and making their cuts or additions to the budget, the reconciliation bill public, all of the standing committees have now had their markup hearings, and they have passed the cuts out of committee that they have agreed are the things that they want to do. So the last three committees went this week. Energy and Commerce, Agriculture, which deals with SNAP cuts, and Ways and Means. That means today at 8 this morning, the House Budget Committee is gathering all of the cuts and the additions into one big bill. And that budget committee is having its markup hearing on the entire thing today. And then if and when they vote on that one big bill being acceptable, it will go to another committee called the Rules Committee. And that committee's job is to say, is this bill ready to be scheduled for a full floor vote? And that's expected Monday. So the Rules Committee will get the one big bill Monday, assuming the Budget Committee does what it's supposed to do today, which is bless the changes from all of the standing committees. That's important in terms of process, because we are learning as of this morning that there may be amendments to this bill that the Rules Committee might make on Monday. Okay, so today and through the weekend and tomorrow become important in terms of, will we be able to delay what the Rules Committee does or influence how they amend the bill? If the Rules Committee says, yes, this is ready for prime time, it's ready to go to the full House for a vote, which would be right on the time frame that Speaker Johnson wants, we might expect that next week we could be seeing the House schedule a full vote, the full House schedule a vote on the reconciliation bill next week, obviously after the Rules Committee. So Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, because remember, Friday is the day when Congress is supposed to be coming home in district, next week, Friday, the 23rd. We will be for Memorial Day recess. We will be moving up the date for this webinar till Thursday at 9, recognizing many people will be on their way to do Memorial Day things and may not be, the diehards that would be here at 9 o'clock on next Friday. But I think that by next Thursday, we will have seen a lot of activity already and have some sense about the direction in which this is going. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of what are the ideas, it's important to remember that all of these cuts are choices. There is no way to take a huge sum of money out of Medicaid without taking health care away from people. So this idea that you can make a huge reduction in Medicaid spending at the federal level and it doesn't have any impact on the people who use Medicaid is not true. I think most of us here would probably agree with that, but that may not be the message that Congress wants people to believe. The people who lose their Medicaid coverage are going to be worse off as a result. And I think lots of you have been making the case about how important Medicaid is to your daily lives and what it would mean if even small changes happen to what was covered. And the third piece is, and I have Republicans in here because that is the majority party, this is a cut that is happening because of priorities and philosophy, not fiscal necessity. And you may hear members of Congress saying, well, we have to make cuts. Do you? Because again, tax breaks are also a choice. So you are choosing to reduce the amount of revenue that the federal government is taking in. And it may be logical to say if we are reducing the amount of money that we are taking in, that means we have less to spend, we should spend less. That's a logical statement. But spending less doesn't mean you have to cut Medicaid. You could look at your defense contracting spending, for example. You could look at lots of different things. You could do less tax breaks. You could let tax cuts expire. There are lots of choices that Congress could make here, and I think that's the point. These are choices. The choices here are to reduce the amount of revenue that the government has to spend and to make spending cuts, and these spending cuts are coming to primarily Medicaid and also SNAP and also many other things. And that is a matter of priority. Which things you decide to cut and which things you decide to increase spending on are choices. The cuts that are being made don't solve the problems that Congress has been talking about. We've been talking about since January, the idea that some of the things that Congress has been saying it feels are problems they would like to solve. And the cuts, some of the rhetoric does not match what the problems are here. When somebody says, well, we're not making cuts, and yet there's a reduction of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars to Medicaid, no, that is a cut. It is not an effective way to deal with fraud, waste, and abuse to just take money out of the system without any specifics about how that actually reduces fraud, waste, and abuse. You may claim you don't want undocumented immigrants in Medicaid, but they aren't getting Medicaid. So these are some of the problems that Congress has been talking about in the public sphere, but they aren't really going to be solved by the changes that are being proposed. And most importantly, from our perspective, is when these choices that are being made about what to cut specifically to Medicaid aren't going to improve the programs that we know and use right now. They're not going to help more people. stay in their homes and live independently. In fact, we're very worried that cuts of the scale will cause states to have to think about how they reduce their own Medicaid programs, and that some of the things that we think are very important for people to be able to live in their homes might be among the first things that will be looked at as a place to cut. These cuts aren't going to address the shortage of care workers or increase the payments to small business providers that people use all the time for health and long-term care. That isn't going to address what we would say is a current problem now. And it doesn't change the reality that you have people who can't get the care they need anywhere but Medicaid because the private sector insurance market either doesn't provide it at all, or doesn't provide enough, or doesn't cover it for a long enough time that it really fulfills what people need. And a lot of those needs, like Medicaid is the primary payer for long-term care supports, both home and community supports and nursing home care, because the private sector doesn't pay for that. It also is the major payer for mental health care. And again, the private sector main insurance doesn't necessarily pay for the amount of care that many people who have long-term needs need. So it doesn't address any of the things that we, from a disability or aging perspective, might think are real problems that Medicaid has now. So before we start, some of you have been listening to members of Congress and have received letters back, and have reported back to us some of the things that members of Congress have said. In February, oh, we're not going to cut Medicaid. This won't impact you. We're only targeting fraud, waste, and abuse. We're going to protect the vulnerable. Now, you know, they are going to be cutting Medicaid, and we think that vulnerable people will be impacted with some certainty. So here's what we know. Last week, the package of ideas that we knew were likely to be part of the proposal to cut Medicaid totaled $400 billion. And that is a lot less than $880 billion, which is the original amount the committee was told to target. And then last week I said, now that could mean a couple different things. Maybe they reduce their tax cuts. Maybe they might find some other ideas. You know, we talked a lot about how there were certain ideas that seemed like they were off the table and certain ideas that maybe had more support. Here's what happened. They did, in fact, find a lot of other smaller ideas that got that total of Medicaid cuts higher than $400 billion. We now have an initial Congressional Budget Office estimate that the ideas that the Standing Committee Energy and Commerce passed to cut Medicaid will mean about $715 billion in cuts to Medicaid. And when combined with some other changes to the Affordable Care Act provisions, and some people with disabilities and older adults do purchase their care from ACA marketplace exchanges, that the initial estimate for how many people would lose healthcare coverage is 13.7. And I think about 8.7 million of those people would be people who lose coverage, who lose Medicaid coverage. These are initial estimates. I think these numbers are fluid. They're going to change. There are still some ideas that the Congressional Budget Office hasn't, considered yet. This was just an initial assessment that was given to the Democrats and made public. But each idea is going to receive a score, and that score will say how much money do we project it will save over time, and how many people do we think might lose their insurance, and how many of those people who lose their insurance will remain uninsured. Those are kind of the three metrics that the Congressional Budget Office will look at. Next week is the anticipated timeline when we might see those estimates kind of be fully fleshed out. Now, it's also important to know that some of the ideas that are in these cuts are still fluid. So what that means is we may see some changes even before the Congressional Budget Office completes its, does its first estimate of what was passed this week. So I think that just for people to be out there, what we're saying is these are the estimates based on the first initial analysis. They could go higher and they could change. And the ideas that were in the bill that the standing committee passed could also change. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Big picture, at least $715 billion of federal Medicaid spending. And that at least is really about, we think that could go higher because we don't have the full picture from the Congressional Budget Office yet. Absolutely would be the largest cut to Medicaid ever. I'll give you a link directly to the memo that the Democrats received from the Congressional Budget Office so you can read it yourself. What are the ideas that were in the standing committee? I'm not going to go through each and every one in detail, but it's an overall picture that I think will be familiar to you if you've been attending these webinars for a while. Yes, there are prove your working exempt or prove your exempt requirements for everybody who's already in Medicaid. And notice that the age range has expanded. This would be mandatory. All states would have to do this. And it does appear that these working and exempt requirements would be applied to everyone in Medicaid who is either in the state plan or a waiver program. That's important because many states have said to the federal government, okay, we'd like permission to have a certain kind of program that serves a certain population of people. Those are called waivers. And they're usually they usually have numbers like 1115 waiver. That 1115 is a number that refers back to a piece of the federal statutes. But it's important to know that most states have multiple waivers. We have multiple waivers in Wisconsin. Badger Care is an 1115 waiver. Family Care, IRIS, CLTS are all waiver programs. MAP has a waiver. So it's a very common framework, and waiver usually means the program that you know that is familiar to you. And that means that those requirements are intended to apply to everyone who is in Medicaid now, no matter what your entry point is into Medicaid. There are a series of exemptions, and I think that Congress is really pointing to those exemptions in the statute as the way that they are protecting vulnerable people. You should have in the back of your mind, what do you need to do to prove you're exempt? Because just because there's a category in the statute doesn't mean that you automatically fall into it. And in fact, these requirements will require states to do a lot of scrutiny, a lot of process and administration for people to either prove that they're working or prove that they're exempt. And that can actually be sometimes a harder process than people realize. There's also, when I look at some of the language for the exemptions, as we have discussed before, those exemptions don't necessarily fully exempt the people that we think should be included. So just understand that having states have to do this and having things in the statutes that indicate there are certain kinds of populations of people that should be exempt doesn't mean that everybody we think belongs in those categories will end up being exempt, and they will end up having to prove that they're exempt. The other pieces that are important here, the prove your working exempt requirements appear to put in a barrier for new applicants. So if you haven't been in Medicaid before, or maybe you've lost coverage and you have to reapply to get in, you have to prove that you're already meeting the prove your working requirements before you can be enrolled. And that's a really big change. There's also some changes that if you don't prove you're working enough and you get disenrolled from Medicaid, that you're limited from enrolling in ACA marketplace plans. There are some requirements about checking certain people's Medicaid eligibility more often. There's a little bit of debate. I've seen it both ways, where some people say this applies to everyone. Some people say it applies to only people who are part of the Medicaid expansion population. And remember, Wisconsin did not expand under the Affordable Care Act. So again, there's some nuance here that people are still trying to figure out. It is true that there are going to be more things that need to be verified on the part of the state before somebody can be proven eligible. So, change of address verification, for example, is one of the elements that now need to be absolutely verified before your eligibility can be verified. And for people who move quite frequently, that actually can be a big deal, because there may be a lag between, when somebody submits a change of address, or if they know to do that. Again, one more piece of information that needs to be checked. There are also some checks, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, requiring comparison against the Social Security DED file for both providers and for Medicaid participants. And that's important because there have been a growing number of mistakes. People who are living who are accidentally marked deceased in that Social Security DED file. Now, this would require statutorily states to automatically disenroll people who appear on that DED file, which just tells you that if there's a mistake in one place that needs to be corrected, it actually has an effect in other places pretty immediately. A decrease in what's called retroactive coverage. So right now, if you are a person who is ill, or something has happened and you turn out to be eligible for Medicaid, all of the bills from the previous 3 months, whenever you're eligible, can be covered by Medicaid. And that's really a big deal, because a lot of times, especially with hospitalizations or with nursing home care, maybe there's been something where somebody has had to be admitted to a facility, or you've had really high healthcare expenses that have occurred over a period of time, especially with long or significant illnesses. That 3-month window of having Medicaid be able to pay for the costs that have been incurred before you were actually in the program is extraordinarily helpful. This bill would want to shorten that to 1 month. And you can see that if somebody ends up losing their Medicaid coverage through mistakes, and has to go back and try and get re-enrolled, if something happens to them in that time period when they've lost coverage, now there is a significantly lower amount of time that Medicaid will look back on their bills. And a lot of folks are worried that you know, especially if you have people who have lost coverage where something happens to them, they may end up with a lot of costs that are incurred that they can't pay and that Medicaid won't cover. There are changes also that impact specifically states that are trying to control the amount of spending states will make if they want to change, you know, what they're doing in a waiver. Waivers are renewed sometimes every 5 years is usually about the right cycle. So that's a super nerd thing. But again, the idea is, hey, we want to make sure that states aren't changing their waivers in a way that will increase federal spending. So you can see that that kind of has an impact on maybe changes that states would like to make, including, you know, payment, increasing provider payments. There are also changes that would specifically freeze states' ability to use provider taxes at the level they are now. And lots of states use that as a source of revenue that they put in to make up their state match. Wisconsin does use provider taxes. Every state does except for Alaska. This may have less of an impact for our state, but certainly for some states that is one of the main reasons or main ways that they are funding a good portion of the amount of money that they are required to match to the federal government. A lot of these changes will mean increased administrative work or cost for states. And there are changes that would financially penalize states for any mistakes. So you're increasing the amount of administrative process, which really means increasing the opportunity for mistakes. You're increasing the amount of work and cost for states to do those processes. And you're also putting in provisions that say if you make mistakes, then we're going to financially penalize you for that. What does that all mean? I spent a lot of time talking there. Big picture, less federal money to states. That will create state budget holes. All states are going to be somewhat impacted by this. Some states will be more impacted than others, but no state is not going to be impacted. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Even if somebody says to you, well, Wisconsin isn't as impacted as other states, we're still impacted, and significantly so. It's a matter of degree, right? So, you know, if you are a state that has the worst of the consequences compared to a state that has less consequences, that doesn't mean there's no consequences. It's a sliding scale, right, of harm. It absolutely means that there will be more things for states to do, more paperwork for people, right? That's part of this. And it means that mistakes will cost people their Medicaid coverage. Keep in mind, when the Congressional Budget Office assigns a score and says there'll be, and I'm using the initial score, there will be $300 billion in savings over 10 years if you implement mandatory work requirements for all states. That's the figure, $300 billion. That $300 billion is all coming from people who are losing their Medicaid coverage. That is how we're saving money. That there are people who can't get through the process, that, you know, stop trying, or there are mistakes and they lose coverage for partial time or permanently. That's how the cost savings are being calculated. And vulnerable populations, even though Congress has said we don't want to harm certain kinds of people, we've talked a lot since January about how you can't target harm to only certain people in Medicaid, and you can't protect people when you're making overall big cuts. Vulnerable populations are not going to be protected, even if the bill exempts some groups of people from work requirements. And there's two big reasons why. First of all, the big cuts to Medicaid are so large that it will mean there are budget problems for states. And again, you may be in a state that has a lot worse problem, but I don't think there's going to be a state that has no problems. And for most state budgets, which are required to be balanced, even problems that are a couple $100 million in mismatch are issues. Like you can't, there's no deficit spending in states. So even small tweaks can of hundreds of millions of dollars or $1 billion or $5 billion, when it comes to the overall state budget, every reduction in federal spending means that the state either has to find that amount of money and increase the spending for Medicaid at the expense of other things or increase taxes. And there have been articles, one of them is cited on this slide, you'll get it, that absolutely say that isn't feasible. It isn't feasible to make this scale of cuts and not have states cut Medicaid because they just don't have the finances to be able to fill in the gap that the federal spending reductions make, which leaves states really with three choices. You can either change who can or can't get into Medicaid, change who you serve. You can change what you pay for and the amount you pay businesses for that. And you can change what the services are. And I think for vulnerable populations, which are typically, the catch-all for people with disabilities and older adults, this is the piece that is really important because, and we've talked about this before, there are certain services that states have to pay for under federal law. And some states that federal law says you can do this, but you don't have to. And a lot of the things that people with disabilities and older adults most rely on fall into that optional category and have been the target of when there have been tight budgets in the past. Those are the services that have been targeted first. Okay. Little reminder, here are the things that are mandatory. Mandatory means states have to do them. Optional means states can choose to do them. And there are lots of things in the optional category that are surprising, right? Like prescription drugs is an optional service that states can choose. So you can see where a state in a tight budget scenario might say, do we have to cover all the drugs? Or can we cover generic versions only? Like what are our you're in a mindset of, if I'm having to find a way to spend less money, how do I do it? And you're probably looking at your optional benefits first because there's been nothing in this bill that changes what states have to do. And notice that nursing facilities and institutional care are in the mandatory category. So states still have to do that. But home and community-based services, which is everything you know about Family Care Iris and the Children's Long-Term Care Program, are optional services. Okay. So, when you are in a situation where you're looking at where your choices are few and far between, it is more likely that changes will impact the things that are on the optional side than it is on the mandatory side. And states might choose to say, well, maybe we won't change the program, but maybe we'll have waiting lists again, right? Or maybe that's an option to say, here, we're going to change who can get in the program. And lots of states have done some combination of those three options to try and drive down how much they're spending on Medicaid programs. Here's the other reason why disability advocates are so worried that home and community-based services, which absolutely are the most cost-effective thing that people want, are potentially at risk. That's where 50% of all of the optional spending is. So on that previous slide, you saw that partial list of all of the optional services. That's where we spend half the money. of all of our optional services is on home and community-based care. So like I'll pick on chiropractic services. That is in a specifically high spending category, right? You could eliminate chiropractic services entirely and you wouldn't save that much money because you're not spending that much money. So it makes sense that if you are in a budget scenario where you need to reduce the amount of money you're spending, you're going to look at the higher spending categories. And home and community-based services is the high spending category. And who uses those services? Adults with older adults and people with disabilities. 86% of all of the optional services are spent on those two populations of people. So, and those are often the people who are using home and community-based services too. So, you know, on the optional side, if you are looking at reducing the amount of spending, it is highly likely that your reductions are going to impact those two vulnerable populations of people that Congress has said that they don't want to impact. The other piece is nursing homes and institutions are mandatory, and nothing about this bill changes what services are mandatory. So states are going to have to continue doing that, right? And that means if, you know, if home and community-based services are cut or waiting lists are restarted, then the only thing left is nursing homes and institutions. And I put in if you could access them, because there are national disability advocates who are concerned that nursing homes aren't going to simply, you know, expand the number of Medicaid patients they take. They could hold that pretty steady because they're not making money on Medicaid patients often. So the other reason why these changes impact vulnerable populations is the paperwork piece. More paperwork, more mistakes means fewer people in Medicaid. And if you make the mistake, you're one of the fewer people in Medicaid. So national experience is consistent that even people who are in exempt categories end up falling through the cracks. And think about what the states are being asked to do. They've got to figure out how often, who has to prove that they're working, and how do you prove that, and how often do we need to check, and what kind of process do we need to have to accomplish that. They also have to have a process of how do we decide who fits in these exempt categories, and what kind of proof or documentation do we need from them to prove that they belong in this exempt category, and how often do they need to prove it. You actually have some experience with these types of processes because we have a Medicaid eligibility check every year right now. And many people with disabilities, in fact, in a hearing a few weeks ago, would have said, like, I have to prove that I have a disability every time I reapply to stay in Medicaid. That is part of our process now, that you have to, you know, every year go through a process that reproves something that is already known, right? For a lot of people, it's really hard to navigate our current process. And we are adding more process, potentially, more things that need to be done, maybe on a more frequent basis. There's some language in this bill that would allow states to prove your working requirement checks as much as every month, which certainly has an impact on people whose seasonal income rises and fluctuates, or who may have a variety of part-time jobs. And you have to be able to successfully navigate all of these things on time in order to stay in Medicaid. Any mistake, and it doesn't have to be by the person, any mistake could mean that you lose your coverage. And we've all experienced the person in the state agency who has accidentally checked the wrong box, and that wrong box being checked has created a nightmare of problems, like potentially people being disconnected from Medicaid. Those things happen. Human error happens. Automation doesn't fix that because we've certainly seen examples where you know, an automated system has accidentally checked a whole bunch of boxes that shouldn't have been checked, and people have lost their coverage. And then it becomes the responsibility of the person who's lost the coverage to say, hey, something's wrong here, and get it corrected. And for lots of you who have, kind of been in the process of doing all the forms, you may have run into situations where a mistake has happened and you've needed to spend a lot of time and mental energy and talk to a lot of different people or refile paperwork or regather documentation to correct those mistakes. That is going to be a routine thing. If it isn't a routine thing now, it's going to become more routine. And it has big consequences because delays or loss of coverage mean a lot of things, especially if you are a person with who has daily care needs. We've certainly seen in the last year, several people contacted us with the Medicaid unwinding. There was just a reevaluation process that all states had to do to kind of make sure everybody who is in Medicaid is eligible to be there. For a while during the pandemic, states didn't have to do those checks, and that expired. And so everybody had to be reevaluated. And there were people who lost their coverage for a variety of reasons. There were people who lost coverage accidentally who were in MAP a while ago. And the cascading effect is, people's needs don't turn off when their Medicaid coverage does. So we heard from people who said, hey, I can't pay my daily support staff because I'm fighting to get back in Medicaid and I've lost my whole provider network and I can't just turn that back on. I can't just say, hey, a month from now, providers come back. Those folks have taken other jobs, or I have gone down to the bottom of the client list because I didn't have coverage and they've reassigned all of my workers. So it can be really impactful. And all of the ideas that increase paperwork, remember, they save money because people are losing their Medicaid coverage. The other piece is there are lots of folks who are in Medicaid who actually need help from somebody to be able to do the paperwork steps now, which is renewing eligibility. And so you're adding more paperwork that someone else, likely an unpaid caregiver, if there is one in their life, but maybe it's a caregiver who's helping with paperwork, a paid caregiver, or maybe it's a social worker in a nursing home. There are plenty of people who are in Medicaid who are not able to accomplish these things themselves for a variety of reasons. And that makes them even more vulnerable to having somebody else watch out for them and be able to do these things on time so they don't have a gap in coverage or lose it altogether. The ways, like we heard some good testimony several weeks ago, hey, I can't use my hands, so pre-populated forms are really important to me, right? Like there are plenty of people who are very capable of lots of things, but maybe filling out paperwork isn't one of them. And certainly some of the people that have the hardest time doing these things independently in themselves, they may have other barriers. They may not have good access to the internet. They might not be drivers. If you're a person who finds it difficult to hear on the phone, a phone menu might be really hard for you. There are lots of people who are non-readers and lots of forms that are overly complex that don't need to be. People who have difficulty writing or cognitive processing limitations. Lots of people who are on Medicaid now who really rely on other people to help navigate through the paperwork process. And if there aren't people in their lives who can do that, I think their coverage could be really at risk. All right, so that is kind of what we know now about the cuts that passed out of energy and commerce, why we think that they would impact even vulnerable populations of people. And we do think that maybe this isn't the final menu of cuts. In fact, this morning I was revising this presentation because that appears to be the case. There are lots of folks in the House fiscal conservatives, that are not satisfied with the level of cuts that have come out of the Energy and Commerce Committee. $715 billion is not enough. And there are certainly people, a couple of opportunities for this bill to be amended further. So we may not, when I say that these cuts are fluid, it may be that what we see on paper as of this moment will shift and change a little bit, and those shifts could have pretty big impacts for states and for people with who rely on Medicaid. The other thing, it wasn't only Medicaid. There have been $300 billion in cuts proposed to SNAP, which is food share in Wisconsin. And there are a number of proposals in the Agriculture Committee as well. Lots of people who are in SNAP are also in Medicaid. So, you know, these cuts hit those people who are in both programs at the same time. And we had 2 representatives of Wisconsin's delegation that serve on the Agriculture Committee. Big line, the big takeaway is that a lot of these changes kind of lower the amount of food aid households might receive. There are also changes to, again, prove you're working or prove you're exempt requirements so that those requirements apply to more people. And the big change is that states would be required to provide a match in order to receive food aid, and they would have to provide an increasing amount of match if they have mistakes and overpayments, up to 25%. I think there is a flat, every state has to now match 5%. And then depending on your error rate, then you may have to match additional percentages all the way up to 25%. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually a lot of money. And food aid at the federal level has been entirely federally funded thus far. So this is the first time that states actually have to find state money in order to receive the food aid from the federal government. So some of the changes to and we do have existing work requirements in food share in this state. We covered a little bit of that last week. So they've kind of said, okay, we're going to reduce the amount of exemption for caregivers of children. It used to be up to 18. They're moving that back to 7. Now the working age for people subject to work requirements or exempt, you have to prove you're exempt, is 18 to 64. I believe Wisconsin's current requirements are 18 to 49. So a big jump in how old, you know, where do we consider somebody old enough that we wouldn't expect them to be subject to work requirements. There are certain types of bills that at this point are removed from your income for the purposes of calculating how much food aid a household gets. There are some changes that would not, you know, would say, nope, we're not taking that expense out of your income, and that reduces how much food aid a household can get. There's also some things that would make it much harder for states to say, hey, we're not going to have these requirements apply to this group of people or to this area. there's a lot of flexibility for states right now to say, okay, there's these requirements, but the conditions in these areas, we think we should not apply those requirements because there's too many people who are hungry and not enough jobs in the area. The provisions in the bill would make it really hard for states to do that. And lots of states have these waivers and have had them in effect for a long time because the priority has been making sure that people who need food aid can get it. And we've kind of covered already that states are now going to have to pay a lot more state money to continue to receive federal food assistance. Obviously, when you're making changes to the work requirements, again, there's more process. It applies to more people. You have increased administrative costs to run the program. And if you make mistakes, you have to pay in more money as the state. So it's a more expensive program to run. We've also talked about what are some of the tricks that Congress uses to make to kind of futz around with, when things take effect and whatnot. All of them are being used in this bill. Some of the implementation timelines they've set out into the future, conveniently past elections. That's a strategy, and we'll talk about that. There are some changes that, especially in the tax areas, that they're saying, well, we'll make them take effect now and set another deadline in the future that we'll have to revisit it. That's a strategy to keep costs down. There's certainly a couple of instances, especially the Medicaid cuts, where they're going to potentially give the Department of Health and Human Services the job of making an administrative rule that tells states what they absolutely have to do. And remember, there's been an executive order that says, yeah, we're not going to do public comment on rules. So this could be entirely done within a federal agency, and states get told at the end of it, maybe without a lot of input on the process. A lot of the ideas here are pushing costs onto states for administering programs. And that means you're putting pressure on state budgets. Just because you tell states that they have to do some things doesn't mean they have the resources or staff to do it. And if you ask fewer people to do more, you likely end up with more mistakes. So there's been a lot of talk about some of the implementations for these ideas are set years in the future. And some members of Congress are trying to tell people not to worry about these cuts, or say that somehow they're not really cuts because, they don't take effect right now. And I think we need to talk about that because this is a strategy. Implementation deadlines, putting them out in the future is a strategy to try and distance yourself from the actual action and decision making that has happened today and when the pain of the cut starts. Everybody knows, because you've all been out here since January, that there are lots of people who are mobilized and watching now, okay? And what they want to say is, don't worry about this. It won't impact you in the future, and maybe we'll come back and revisit it and change it later. Do not believe that. There are, in fact, a lot of examples where something has been done and then it sunsets later and things disappear, or something gets put in the statutes and it's never come back and changed. One good example, two good examples of this, there was a child tax credit that was passed and it had a sunset date. The same is true for the Affordable Care Act subsidies that are keeping premiums low. Those subsidies are going to expire at the end of this calendar year. This reconciliation bill does not extend them. So that's an example of, at one moment in time, a previous Congress, who had some of the same members and some different ones, said we're going to appropriate a whole bunch of money for the purpose of keeping people's marketplace premiums low. And probably a compromise at the time was to say, well, we don't want to fund it forever, so we're going to set a sunset date in it. And that means we can come back and we can extend it. They're not extending it. This is the same type of idea where we'll put the implementation deadline out there so that it doesn't happen right away. And then we'll hope people will forget about it. But we really don't have an intention of coming back and not doing the cut. They know that it takes a lot of effort to convince Congress to make changes. All of the effort that has gone into Medicaid cuts from January to now, from thousands of people across this country, it's a high level of effort to get Congress to be aware that what they are doing is not popular. And breaking that momentum is going to be key to letting those changes happen in the future. And people should also realize that some of these implementation dates are designed to be just after the 2026 midterm elections. So the same president is in charge. Even if Congress completely changes and you have different majorities, the same person is in the executive position and that person has veto authority. So, the idea that delaying implementation means the cuts won't happen is not true. And in fact, even the House fiscal conservatives are picking up on that idea. They see that the implementation delays are a tactic, and it doesn't really fit with their goals to reduce spending. They are correct on this. If you are making decisions that dramatically reduce the amount of revenue that is coming in for the government to spend, and you are not also reducing the spending at the same time, what you're doing is increasing the deficit. And for these folks, that's really important. So they are correct. You should, if you are serious about making something, cost neutral, you have to reduce your spending reductions at the same time your revenue is being reduced. And this is one of the changes that we are expecting may be part of an amendment that the Rules Committee does on Monday. They want to implement, especially the work requirements changes sooner. And it's being telegraphed this morning that perhaps there might be an amendment in the Rules Committee on Monday that would do that. Well, moving up the implementation deadline does mean several $billion more savings, because the amount of people losing their insurance, their Medicaid, happens more quickly, right? So you are saving more. This is why we're kind of fluid on the numbers, right? Because as there are more and more amendments, then the Congressional Budget Office is kind of behind already on calculating the savings, and then you're changing the ideas. They're also not satisfied that the cuts to Medicaid in particular are enough. So I don't think we're going to end up having them wait for the CBO scores, at least to get through today's budget committee meeting. But that might be a sticking point that could cause delay on voting for the whole bill by the full House. And there's also some concerns that the language isn't strong enough to prevent non-expansion states, Wisconsin is one of those, to not broaden their Medicaid programs. So I think there's several big points the fiscal conservatives have, and they've already kind of been won the idea of moving the implementation date closer on the work requirements. We've kind of talked about the process. I've moved our star. We are on track next week to have a full House vote. So it's important for advocates to do everything they can to delay it. And the reason I'm going to say that is because now we know what the plans are. They're not hidden anymore. And it's important for Congress to understand that their constituents know what these cuts mean. There's a big incentive for the House to move fast, because the longer you leave, the more daylight there is between the ideas becoming public and the public understanding them and the public not liking them, the harder it becomes to pass the bill quickly. So there's a real incentive to pass this as quickly as possible so that they're done, hands off. It's a way of pressuring their own members to just vote yes without fully knowing what's in the bill. And it is also a way for the House to say, here's what we've done, Senate, you start your work. Now we've completed our part. They're trying to outrun you right now. So they're trying to outrun the people who are aware that what is in this bill is going to have an impact on states and real people in a way that they don't like. And remember, Congress is due to come home next Friday. The Senate is also incentivized to move fast for a couple of reasons. We've talked about them not going through a full committee process. That's been what's been telegraphed. And they may take what the House does and amend it. So again, this is fluid. The ideas are not set in stone. Even if the House passes its bill next week, the Senate still has to decide whether or not they're going to go with the ideas the House had or change them in some way. And change could be take out the cuts. So in no way should you assume that any of this is fixed. It's all fluid right now. But what has changed is the so-called X date. That is the date in which the federal government runs out of money to pay its bills and runs the risk of defaulting on money it's already spent. The debt ceiling is what is often referred to. That date has been moved up into August. So you'll see that the Senate's goal is to pass their version of the reconciliation bill by July 4th. That now looks like it is more solid in terms of a deadline, if really August is the reasonable deadline for the debt default. Because remember, whatever the Senate passes, and I do think the Senate will make changes from what the House is doing, that the Senate and the House have to agree on the same language. And the debt ceiling, raising the debt ceiling, is part of this bill. So it becomes a must-pass item unless the government wants to default on the money it's already spent and it already owes. And we've never done that. And I think a lot of members of Congress would not want to do that. So you can kind of see the strategy of putting everything into one big bill and then tightening the timeline so it has to pass relatively quickly. Those are strategies to try and get things across the finish line and into legislation that might not otherwise end up there if it was a different process. So anyway, if the Senate does get to the point where they are moving this along through June, and then the House has to basically agree to what the Senate's done, that's the point where it would go to the president. And that kind of needs to happen before August. There have been one senator has been particularly vocal about not wanting to do Medicaid cuts. And there are a couple of points on this. One, my counterpart from Missouri, you should know that this senator has been contacted by a whole bunch of people just like yourselves who happen to live in Missouri, because my counterpart has emailed me and talked to me about, like some of what is going on there. So Senator Hawley has some strong feelings about Medicaid and sees it as a social insurance program for a lot of the constituents that he represents. He also happens to live in a state that expanded Medicaid through constitutional amendments. So he's not a person that has supported some of the more draconian cuts to Medicaid, but also notice that he's telegraphing that prove your working requirements, he doesn't consider cuts. So that's important in the sense that they are cuts. They are going to reduce spending people's coverage. And it's an example of even somebody who is not supportive of the most harsh ideas to cut Medicaid is kind of rationalizing that some ideas to cut Medicaid aren't cuts in his mind and are okay. It is also notable, this was an article that was published in the New York Times. So there's two ways to look at that. There's, you know, the senator saying, hey, we shouldn't do this as a lone person does take some courage, right? Especially when not everybody in his party agrees with him. But it's also a sign that he's making that public statement because there are a lot of people in his caucus that don't agree with him, right? So it's a way of adding public pressure to his own colleagues in a very public way. And there are a number of senators who are not satisfied with the level of cuts that have been proposed, that are very much in agreement with the fiscal hawks in the House. Our US Senator Ron Johnson is one of them, and he has been publicly saying he wants to return to pre-pandemic, like, you know, the spending that the government was doing prior to 2020 levels of spending. That would mean $6 trillion in spending cuts, which is a lot more than the $2 trillion we've been talking about. And, you know, he is being very public. He's going to vote no unless there are deeper cuts. So that no vote is really a leverage point to advocate for more spending cuts rather than less. And, you know, he's in a powerful position, you know, on the committees he serves to have some leverage and really influence the bill. And it's important for us to know that the way he wants to influence that bill may be to make further cuts. And I have not heard from him that Medicaid is a place that he doesn't think needs cutting. So we've started moving along here. And I think it's important to start asking some questions now that we know what the ideas are. And now that we've heard what Congress is kind of saying, well, we're protecting the vulnerable. We're doing all of, you know, these aren't really cuts. Now is another opportunity for constituents to kind of show that we understand what they're saying isn't exactly true. It does not match our experience. And we have some examples of questions in the next couple of slides. The other thing is reacting publicly is now more important than ever. So Congress is coming back home for a week, the 23rd through the 30th. Now's the time to set up in-district meetings, you know, talking to the press, being critical on op-eds, using social media. Like now you have a sense of what are these cuts and how would they maybe impact your life, real people's lives. We obviously want to delay this because, again, the more this is delayed, the more opportunity there is to have daylight, you know, between when the ideas are introduced and see what they actually are and what their impacts are. So the next few days are really important to demonstrate that we understand that these are cuts and that they actually matter to people who use Medicaid, and to say, slow down, like you don't need to do this next week. If we can't delay a vote, make it a hard vote. Make it a vote where members of Congress know that by raising their hand and saying yes to this, there are constituents who will see that and will have some questions. And ask those questions in district. And then the fourth goal is, even if the House does vote for it next week, we have a real opportunity to show the Senate how unpopular what the House is doing is, because they will have the opportunity to change the language and change it so it is not as impactful as it is now. So what are questions to ask? We've come up with a few that are relevant. Again, challenging the idea that you're protecting vulnerable people. There is no assurance or guarantee that the services that people with disabilities and older adults actually use will end up being protected. Saying somebody is exempt from the prove your working requirements is not the same as protecting the actual services that people use. That still ends up being a fiscal issue for the states to figure out when they get less money from the federal government. I think it's really important to ask about paperwork, especially if you're a person that needs help to complete the paperwork, or if you're somebody that is helping a person or multiple people complete the paperwork. Talking about the amount of time and energy that takes is important. And talking about what happens if you weren't there to do that paperwork for the person who can't do it themselves is important. Asking the questions about, you say that we're exempt, but exactly how do I prove that is important, especially for unpaid caregivers. The language in the legislation as it is now, the exemption for caregivers, because there is one, is fairly narrow. It is for parents, guardians, or caregivers of a person with a disability. Interesting that we assume that either a person with a disability has a parent that is there and doing that unpaid work, because that isn't always the case. Interesting that there's an assumption that if it's not a parent, it's a guardian, because that's not always the case. There are lots of people with disabilities who don't have guardians. And interesting that it's restricted to people with disabilities. Because if you're an unpaid caregiver of an older adult, which is a lot of people, I'm not sure I don't think that exemption applies to you. This is what I mean about the idea that exemption categories really include everybody. That's an example of, no, there's a lot of people who wouldn't be included under that exemption. And that's a very common scenario where you have somebody who is an unpaid caregiver for an older adult. For those, now that we know that the prove your working requirements are supposed to apply to everyone in Medicaid, including people in waivers, there's a lot of questions to ask about that, right? Like there are certain waivers that, you would assume, and we shouldn't assume, but you would assume would be unaffected. For example, if the requirements are for people who are 18 and older, people in a waiver program where all the people are under 18, you might assume that would not count. But again, you got to ask those questions. And if you're in Medicaid, what happens if you lose your job? What happens if you lose Medicaid? Talk about what it means to have Medicaid delayed, or what has happened when there's been a mistake or a delay or a problem with you renewing your eligibility, renewing your Medicaid. What are the cascading things that have happened already? Because there are plenty of you that have those examples. And we would expect that those kinds of things that you have experience with would become more common for more people. Really briefly, it isn't all the reconciliation bill. This week, the House and the Senate standing committees also heard from Secretary Kennedy. Every federal agency head is getting, being invited before the Senate and House appropriators essentially to be asked questions about the president's 2026 budget. Secretary Kennedy got a lot of questions in both hearings that were both on Wednesday. Not a lot of them were on the budget. A lot of them were on cuts that had already been made. And rather than talking about what was said, I think it's instructive for people to just watch the hearings. If you've got, an hour that you're out gardening or, washing dishes or something, here are the links to the questions and the responses that Secretary Kennedy made. And we should expect that there will be other federal agency heads. I think the Department of Education is coming in front of the House committee next week. So that is an ongoing process. There's also been some big articles about how various changes the administration is making are really impacting whether federal workers can do their jobs or get money to states to do their jobs. Social Security was mentioned in this particular article again. I think that for those of you who are experiencing changes in customer service, this is yet another way that administrative changes that are behind the scenes are impacting how well things work at federal agencies. We are still hearing that appropriations that Congress has made are not necessarily flowing to the places that they should go in a timely manner, and this is impoundment. We did receive our notice of award, and that is true of other aging and disability groups. A notice of award is an official document that says, yep, you're supposed to get money, 2025 money. Whether or not the state is actually able to draw down that money is still an open question, because there have been a lot of instances where either processes have been put in place that were automated before and have now been reverted to manual, or we've lost staff at federal agencies that are the people who know how to get money to states. We are expecting the full document of the president's 2026 budget at the end of the month, which is now feeling closer than it did. So in a couple of weeks, that document should give a more detailed explanation of what the president's proposal is. And we are still expecting that with the changes that have already been made, especially at the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, that the cuts that the 2026 budget is proposing are going to be in addition to those things that have already happened. So we are still worried that the plan that was leaked out to zero out the individual appropriation lines for disability and aging programs, reducing the amount of total funding and sending to a block of funding to states may be part of that detailed plan. We're going to find out fairly soon. And that is a strategy that you can see already is being used in some other programs at the federal level. Again, 2026 budget is a statement of intent, but they've already kind of gotten rid of 40% of the staff from the existing unit of the administration of community living. So it really does feel like this is a plan that is in motion, as opposed to something that we just don't know, we don't know the details of. I talked already about the dead files for Social Security. I think the important point here is just to recognize that the reconciliation bill has a couple of instances where it's now going to require states to use this file as the determinant as to whether a Medicaid participant or a provider of Medicaid services is in fact eligible for the program, right? So if there's a mistake here in the dead file, it now has an automatic consequence in other programs. And if you are the person who has to correct that mistake, you can see that that will cause a lot of delays and a lot of extra work to make sure that you get it corrected in one place and then have to go to other places to make sure that it's correct as well. So action steps, really important. Congress is coming home. You can start asking them to do things. You can start, asking your questions about these proposals and offering explanations. You can invite them to your home to see how critical Medicaid is. You can do drop-in visits. You can invite them to your local group. All of those invites and contacts are important, even if you don't get a response, which has been the experience of a lot of people. It's important that lawmakers receive a lot of asks and a lot of scrutiny, because that tells them that constituents are watching this issue. For those of you affiliated with organizations or small businesses, you can make your requests as well. You can schedule meetings when Congress is home. You can talk about different things maybe that an individual can that are equally important. Some of the challenges that Medicaid has now with regard to caregiver shortages and low provider rates, you aren't able to help everybody who needs it right now. And these cuts aren't going to help solve those problems. These cuts aren't going to help improve and expand people's access to home and community-based services, which are optional. And those are two important things that I would argue we should be investing in. We should make sure that our home and community-based programs really have the capacity to serve everybody who needs it, because that's where people are the safest, is in their community. And it's also happens to be lower cost and where people want to be. You also have a lot to say about how efficient Medicaid actually is. It is efficient in the sense that the state and the federal government are the controllers of the costs, which is not true in the private insurance market. So you could talk about all of the ways and all of the scrutiny that you, either as an individual or a small business, have in order to be a participant or paid by the Medicaid program. It's important that they understand how much effort goes into running Medicaid as it is now, and that it has been working pretty well for a long time. The other thing we saw a first wave of this week, where there were a lot of groups who reacted to the Standing Budget Committee, their cuts. There's going to be opportunities to react in the coming week as well. Certainly in the Rules Committee, if there are amendments that make those cuts deeper, or if we get congressional budget scores, those are two opportunities that you can send out a statement. Doesn't have to be long, a paragraph, a quote, that is enough. And it can be high level. You don't have to have all the answers about how something would directly impact your business now. You know that a big cut has across the board impacts. You know that these cuts aren't solving any current problems that you think exist now. And you know that they're not improving the quality of Medicaid or the capacity to provide care for people who need it. So there are going to be a lot of opportunities to have, again, a very public response from as many organizations as possible, to kind of flood the zone with the media and say, hey, pay attention to this because it's not getting better. Today, the Budget Committee is going to have a vote. Monday, the Rules Committee may amend this package, and we will do our best to tell you what those amendments are and what they mean. And it may come out of that committee. You can react when those CBO scores are released, and we know how much the ideas are going to result in Medicaid dollars and people losing coverage. When it's scheduled for a House vote, you can react. When the House actually votes on the bill, you can react. So there's a lot of inflection points that people can use to keep elevating your voices and saying, hey, we don't like this. This isn't a good idea. This is going to impact us. Overall, we need to keep the pressure high on lawmakers until the full House votes. We've got to react to the House vote. We've got to do an in-district strategy for the week of the 26th and keep the pressure up, because the Senate has to deal with whatever the House passes. If we're successful, we get the House to delay its vote, and that delay buys us some time. If we're not successful, we still keep the pressure up, and the emphasis shifts to influencing the Senate. There's a lot of stuff left to do that will make these ideas either come out of the bill entirely or less impactful than they are now. We often get questions about, I have been calling every day since you know, February, gold star for those people. Um, so I thought this was something somebody said on their Facebook post, and I just grabbed it and threw it in here. I think it's a great thing to say. We're not going away. We're not going away, and we want to talk about investing in Medicaid, not cutting it. And this is another person who, has been very, very active in talking about their family story, which is much more comprehensive than just this particular paragraph. But I think it's important that, excuse me, people know that your activity, every action that you're doing, you are doing for you and a lot of other people who may not be aware or may not be able to say the same things. And with that, I am going to stop. And if there are any questions, Sally, let me know.
I'm trying to get to my unmute. No, I think uh, yes, just you will get a copy of the PowerPoint and the recording after. I think we've answered all the questions. And I think we're good to go.
All right. Go forth, advocates. Go forth and do as you have been for the last several months. You are making such a difference. This is the issue that Congress is talking about, and it's only the issue because you've been talking about it. So we're not done yet. And next week we will have another webinar. It will be a day early, so you can all have a nice Memorial Day weekend. We'll be doing it on Thursday at 9, I believe, instead of Friday at 9, and we'll get our recording out to you as soon as possible.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our interpreters. You always do a great job. We appreciate you. Have a great weekend.